Hello, welcome to another Seeds of Flourishing video. So I thought I'd just do a little video about 5 tracks that launched me down various music rabbit holes. And this would be probably in the period from, 74 is the first example, through to about 84. So over the course of 10 years, 5 tracks that I think had a really big influence on sort of shaping various musical directions. You'll see there's more than 5 tabs, and I'll explain why in a moment. So first up we have the track Killer Queen. So that was released on the 11th of October 1974 in the UK, 21st October 74 in the US. And I think through this single, although Queen had released 7 Seas of Rye, this is the first single that I became aware of the band and launched me off on a fairly deep appreciation of Queen from 74 through to, I suppose, the early 80s. And during that time it never really waned. I wasn't in a position to buy albums by them in 74. That didn't happen till around 78, 79. And then I started buying stuff retrospectively. But going forward, I'd pretty much buy the album every time they released one, up to the album I didn't buy was Innuendo. Sorry. Is that right? I'm trying to think of the one before that, actually. Where are we? The Miracle. Yeah, that's right. So I didn't buy The Miracle, but I did buy Innuendo. And I still to this day do not have a copy and have never owned a copy of The Miracle. But yeah, every other album I've owned in some capacity at some point in my life, and probably some of them multiple copies. I think I know that I actually have A Night at the Opera on cassette, CD, and also vinyl. The next single track I can think of that had a real big impact on pushing me down a certain direction in terms of my musical interests was this track. But there's 2 other tracks which cemented that, and I wanted to mention them as well, but this is the main one. So Into the Valley, 1979 single by the Skids. This came out around about March of 79, so I suspect there was a little bit of a delay from when it got to number 10 in the UK charts to between that and going back to when it was released. But this one, but it was further cemented by, I'm pretty sure on there's 2 other tracks. So there was then Love Song by The Damned in April of 79, and then The Ruts, the track into the track Babylon's Burning, which was released in June. So sort of 1, 2, 3, but it was definitely, I think, this one that pricked my ears, if you like, made my ears prick up when I first heard it, and then it was a natural progression. And these sort of cemented my appreciation for punk rock, I suppose. It's interesting with the Ruts because, of course, they were well known at the time for integrating elements of sort of ska and reggae into their sound as well. So that sort of counts as one, although, like I said, the primary track is going to be this one. Moving on to Am I Evil? So I first heard this on the Friday Rock Show sometime in 1980, And yeah, this definitely acted as a hook, if you like, into new wave of British heavy metal. So that was a big pull. Obviously, again, there's a few other bands that cemented that as well. Like, I can remember around that time hearing stuff off the first Iron Maiden album and stuff by Saxon, although they were, fairly, well, I wouldn't say deep into their career, but they'd already had an album out in 79. But they had, major releases in quick succession once they got into the 80s. And then around about 84, someone had pointed me into the direction of Big Country. So I had someone who I worked with who, at some point, the firm that I worked for sort of split in two, and part of it moved halfway across the country. And the senior tech that I worked with at the time, he was a big rock and hard rock fan. So we always had a lot to talk about during the day when we were working in the lab. And he got back in touch with me after he'd moved, because he took the move over to another lab. And he said, oh, you should check out all these, and I can't even remember what he referred to them, but he said, oh, there's all these metal bands and bands that you wouldn't think of conventional, like classic rock bands, that have a lot of guitar in them. You should check them out. And so he mentioned one was Big Country and the other one was U2. And then sometime after, I heard Wonderland on Top of the Pops, I think, and I was just hooked. And then over in Christmas of 84, I actually went to see them live, and that was my first live gig in a long while. I think prior to that, sometime in 82, I might have seen Hawkwind, and before that Motorhead, and I think Judas Priest. So I'd had a bit of break from seeing live bands, and I was totally blown away by Big Country at that gig. And that would have been around the time of their second album. This particular single was sort of released as a standalone single between The Crossing and Steel Town. So I would have seen them on support for the Steel Town tour. And I'd sort of been aware of their music. I mean, obviously through, there being a connection between the Skids and Big Country through Stuart Adamson. I was aware of that. But it's funny, at that point, I wasn't always following an artist's path through their various bands. I'm not sure why, but it just wasn't a thing that I did as much as I do, say, after the 80s, where I was much more interested in individual band members and the sort of bands they went on to join. But yeah, this pulled me, I suppose, in the direction of, here they're saying new wave, post-punk, Celtic rock. I suppose it was more a move towards this, but probably more a move towards indie rock generally. Bands like Sisters of Mercy, I suppose Killing Joke are a post-punk band. I'm just thinking of all the bands I used to go and see live after this one. So, The Alarm, again another Celtic rock connection. But yeah, definitely pulling me in that direction, away from Nwubum. But then I had a bit of a jolt back to metal, and then obviously on to extreme metal through this. So I remember hearing Creeping Death on, again, the Friday Rock Show, and also I bought a sampler at the time, which was a lot of bands that were playing a similar style of music. I think the album was called Hell Comes to Your House, something like that. Had a number of different bands, some of which were were thrash bands. Some weren't, but were definitely playing more sort of extreme forms of metal. And it was on that as well. So that was a sort of, again, like 1-2, and I ended up buying Ride the Lightning. I also managed to locate, there's a interesting cassette single for this, which has, Am I Evil and Blitzkrieg. So again, interesting link back to this. So, as I'm talking this through, and it's something I'm always aware of, obviously there's cross-pollination going on, because you've got, Into the Valley, which has Stuart Adamson on it, and also Big Country, and then Diamond Head, who are a big influence on Metallica. But I didn't know when I listened to this track that there was necessarily a causal, there was a causal link there, but just not the fact that Metallica held Diamond Head in such high regard. I think it was only when I purchased that, I don't know if any big Metallica fans are listening to this video, but do you remember that, was it called Cliff 'Em All, that video that was released? And there's an interview on that with the band when Dave Mustaine was in the band, and they sort of rattle off all these bands, and Diamond Head were one, and Angel Witch were another. I can't remember who else they mentioned. But yeah, this was definitely key in pushing me down what was, a thrash rabbit hole, and then sort of death metal rabbit hole, and then more extreme than that still, even though previously I'd been on a sort of metal pathway. So it was interesting, because as a result of Big Country, I was having this sort of parallel musical path with me being into indie UK, mainly in UK indie, and I suppose American like thrash metal simultaneously in the sort of early to mid 80s, before it my musical taste got even broader. So I just think I'll stop there, but I thought it'd be interesting to talk about and think about certain tracks that you've listened to from various sources, which clearly have sort of pushed you down a certain musical rabbit hole. And for me, these 5, Killer Queen, Into the Valley, Am I Evil, Wonderland, and Creeping Death, definitely fall into those categories. So thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next video.